And I'll hit the start webinar button and people can start coming in. So just give them a couple minutes.
Absolutely.
You guys are ready?
Yep. Hi, everyone. Thank you all for being here so far. I'm going to give everybody another minute or two to sort of trickle in, deal with any potential tech issues and stuff like that, and then we'll get started in just a minute or two. All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the 2022 Great Decisions Speaker Series, an initiative of the Foreign Policy Association, sponsored locally by the World Affairs Council of St. Louis and UMSL Global, the international office at the University of Missouri St. Louis. UMSL Global has been a partner and sponsor of the Speaker Series for many years, and it is my pleasure to welcome you here today. The World Affairs Council is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization with local chapters across the United States. It's a 501c3 nonprofit, nonpartisan membership organization that connects the citizens of the St. Louis region to the world. It was founded in 1948 with a mission to offer programs which promote understanding, engagement, relationships, and leadership in world affairs. They rely on donations from the community and have annual memberships available. As a personal note, it's important to remember that all politics is local and all politics is global. So it is a really important organization, and this sense of connectedness is very important. My name is Stephen Bagwell. I'm an assistant professor of political science at the University of Missouri in St. Louis, Dr. Mannion's colleague. I will be your moderator today. We will start with her presentation and then have some time for question and answer. Please use the Q&A button in the Zoom bar next to the chat button when you have a question, not the chat button, but the Q&A button. Thank you. And we will monitor that and we'll address those questions as they come in. Please welcome Dr. Anita Mannion. She is an assistant professor of political science and an affiliate faculty member in gender studies at the University of Missouri in St. Louis. She's also the political analyst for KSDK News, the local NBC affiliate. Her research focuses on the impact of policy on issues of equity, particularly in areas of education and elections. With that, I will turn it over to her. Please welcome Dr. Mannion, and thank you all for being here today.
Thanks so much, Stephen. And thanks to UMSL Global and the World Affairs Council of St. Louis for hosting this. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Everyone can see that? I'm going to assume it's a yes. So today I'm going to talk about a few aspects of Biden's foreign policy, but there's so many things to talk about. I chose to just zero in on a few that I think that are really big and have overarching implications. There's a lot more to talk about. We can get into that in the Q&A. Also, we're just going to scratch the surface of these topics. I'm going to try to keep my talk to about 25 minutes. And so again, lots of time in the Q&A to ask about that. Also, I realize there's an aspect of domestic policy that sort of sucked all the oxygen out of the air and is all anyone is talking about this week. And I'm certainly happy to field questions about that in the Q&A as well. So today I'm really going to focus on Biden's agenda and contrasting it to Trump's agenda in terms of COVID, climate change, alliances, and Russia's invasion of Ukraine. As a candidate, Joe Biden ran on a return to normalcy in both the domestic and global arenas, and as a candidate of experience and stability. He contrasted his experience, temperament, and vision for America with those of Donald Trump, and with Trump's foreign policy of America First isolationism. Biden sought a return to the US tradition of liberal internationalism and foreign policy leadership. He believes that successful domestic policy improves America's international reputation and shows the success of liberal democracies compared to autocratic regimes. So in a sense, domestic policy is also part of Biden's foreign policy. He's been particularly concerned about China's efforts to become, as Biden said, the most significant consequential nation in the world. Biden sees China as a glowing geopolitical rival who's competing with the US and attempting to upend America's position of global dominance. I have here a picture of the chaotic withdrawal from Afghanistan on the bottom left corner. This withdrawal did not go well and seemed to run counter to Biden's narrative about how his experience, planning, and steady hand would avoid hasty and botched policies and situations. This withdrawal was viewed poorly by Americans and others around the world. While it wasn't well executed, it was part of Biden's larger foreign policy strategy, though, and that's to end the post 9/11 war on terror and refocus the US's resources and efforts to be a counterweight to China. Biden's foreign policy agenda is centered around bolstering democracies and strengthening alliances while keeping the spread of authoritarianism in check. So that's no small order in the best of times, and I think it's fair to say we are not in the best of times. While China has been a major plank of Biden's agenda, there have been so many other issues on the global stage. I'm going to focus on some of those today. But certainly if folks want to talk more about China, we can do that in the Q&A, and I will weave some about China throughout the presentation. We are living in a time of security, economic, and environmental interdependence. We've been dealing with a global pandemic, and along with that, the supply chain and economic impacts, not to mention the sickness and death that it has caused. Political polarization at home and abroad. So in the top right side, you see the picture of January 6th. That occurred just 2 weeks before Biden's inauguration. And we're in a country in which about a third of Americans do not believe Biden actually won the 2020 election. Images like what happened on January 6th do not bolster confidence in the stability of democracies. Okay, so far this doesn't sound like a very upbeat talk. And we are living in challenging times, but I think there's some positive aspects we can focus on as well. So I'm going to start with this issue that has kind of overshadowed everything for everyone for the last 2 years, and that is the COVID-19 pandemic. When it comes to Trump's policy on the pandemic, he certainly downplayed the pandemic, the length, the severity. He also tightly controlled what the CDC and other government health experts could put out. And Trump preferred to be the administration's conduit for COVID updates himself. We know when it came to public health measures like masking, that former President Trump did not set an example of consistently wearing a mask and often mocked those who did, including Joe Biden. The biggest pandemic success for Trump, however, under his administration was the development of safe and effective vaccines in record times. Vaccines were authorized for emergency use less than a year after the virus was genetically sequenced. And in 2020, under the Trump administration, the US gave about $35 billion in international aid to help with COVID. Under Joe Biden's administration, government science agencies and health officials have been given renewed respect and independence. On his second day in office, Joe Biden rejoined the World Health Organization. And in his first weeks in office, Biden took steps to elevate the role of science in government and re-engage with the global community to combat the pandemic. Biden also got to work to pass the American Rescue Plan, which allotted $11 billion in foreign aid for pandemic assistance. And while he was engaging and contributing with global efforts to combat COVID, much of his efforts, though, were focused on vaccines and testing in the US. It has really been a time when a lot of countries were focused more inwardly. This I pulled from the State Department's website this morning to make sure we had the most recent numbers. And here they tout the fact that we have shipped over 539 million vaccine doses to over 110 other countries. The United States has provided $2 billion out of a planned $4 billion to COVAX, which is the global alliance that's providing COVID vaccines to mid and low income countries. These efforts to help spread vaccines globally are important from a humanitarian standpoint, certainly, but they're also important for self-interested reasons and reasons of public policy, including minimizing these mutations that keep happening and reaching our shores. But China also engaged in vaccine diplomacy over the last couple of years, and arguably they were more effective in certain ways. They acted faster in providing vaccines to other countries. So for example, while the US actually donated more doses of vaccines to Central American countries, China acted quickly. They sold vaccines at a cheaper price than we did. They did donate vaccines to Central America, but while they did that, they also made sure to include strategic diplomatic messaging. In other countries, along with vaccine donations, they would maybe provide loans or other things. So China really used its growing economic and diplomatic muscle to stand as an alternative to US activities and interests. This map shows the population, the percentage of the population that's fully vaccinated across the globe. This shows us that yes, we've made strides, but there's still quite a ways to go in helping to get large swaths of the world vaccinated. At the end of November 2021, only 0.7%, so less than 1% of vaccine doses had been administered in low-income countries, while high and middle-income countries had received 74% of the world's vaccines. This is still an issue. Just in March, over 100 medical and epidemiological professionals sent a letter to Joe Biden asking him to do more about the pandemic globally and saying that America's efforts have not been enough so far. They asked, in addition to just sending vaccines or sending money, that the United States should be sending our vaccine technology, helping to increase manufacturing around the world so countries can manufacture their own vaccines, and to have more funding from Congress, which Joe Biden has asked for, that's still pending. And then also to help send therapeutics and tests around the world in addition to vaccines. The administration has launched Global Vax, which is a USAID program to assist that last mile delivery of vaccines, because with vaccines, it's not just having the doses, it's the logistics as well. While we have reason to believe that pandemics of this sort may no longer be a once in a century situation, thus far we haven't really seen real action in international collaboration for strengthening our global disease monitoring or containment protocols or building capacity for future outbreaks. Much like the last 2 years, we seem to still be experiencing quite a bit of pandemic nationalism. So I think this is an area that the Biden administration has an opportunity to work on and build, maybe once some of these other hot topics kind of clear off their plate a bit. Okay. But when we look at how the world views how the United States has been handling the pandemic, in 2020, under the Trump administration, these are the percentage of folks in these various countries who said the US was doing a good job. By 2021, we can see those numbers dramatically increasing everywhere except for Australia. But that bodes well for the Biden administration, at least in global perception of how we're doing with the pandemic. Then we can look at how folks at home have viewed this. So these are the views of former President Trump's response to the coronavirus. You can see that pretty steadily, it was staying at a very high disapproval rate, around 57%. For Biden, he started with a really high approval rate for his handling of the coronavirus. And that started to taper off towards the end of the summer. People were getting frustrated. There were breakthrough cases even after folks were vaccinated, and things weren't going the way folks expected. Also, Biden's overall approval rating was declining. But we do still see him with a plurality approving of his handling of the coronavirus, and certainly higher numbers than former President Trump had. Another pending global crisis is climate change. We're seeing evidence of wildfires, droughts, rising sea levels, and other indicators of climate change. Governments have pledged to try to limit warming of the atmosphere to 2 degrees Celsius, but more ideally, we would limit that to 1.5 degrees Celsius. When it comes to the Trump administration, Trump seemed to have little concern about climate change and was actually known to mock climate science. Trump sought to expand oil and gas drilling, so fossil fuels weren't really a focus for him when it comes to reducing those. And he rolled back more than 200 environmental regulations, including those governing greenhouse gas emissions. Over Trump's term, the EPA, which has about 15,000 employees, lost over 1,000 employees. In the past, Biden hadn't really been a major player on climate. But when it became clear that he would probably win the nomination, he did start collaborating with experts and activists when it came to climate change. And he ended up developing the most ambitious climate change agenda of any general election presidential candidate. When he was elected, Biden drew a sharp contrast with Trump on this issue right away when he identified climate change as one of his 4 priorities. The others were battling the coronavirus, strengthening the economy, and addressing racial inequality. And so when we look at what happened when Biden actually came into office, so he came in with these grand ideals of how he was going to address climate change. On day 1 of his presidency, he did re-enter the Paris Agreement, which Trump had withdrawn from. And he took a number of, intermittent actions, like appointing an international climate envoy, to create the first ever national climate task force, which has cabinet level leaders collaborating from a lot of different areas to try to address climate change, cancel the permits for the Keystone XL pipeline, pause new leases for oil and gas drilling on public lands, called for increasing renewable energy production, finalize a rule to tighten vehicle pollution emissions. And then he worked on the bipartisan infrastructure bill, which did get passed. That $1 trillion bipartisan infrastructure bill, though, isn't going to have a huge impact on climate change. It does include billions of dollars in new funding for research and development to develop low carbon energy technologies, techniques to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. It also contains $7.5 billion to build a network of electric chargers for electric vehicles. But apart from the vehicle chargers, most of this research and development and technology will not take impact right away. And so we're unlikely to see a major dent in emissions by 2030 under the bipartisan infrastructure bill. So those were some of the maybe more incremental things that Biden did. But when it came to his big goals of reducing emissions by 2030, these are the 3 pillars of Biden's climate change agenda. The first one was this series of clean energy tax credits and other aspects to address climate change in the Build Back Better bill. As you probably know, that bill stalled in the Senate, largely due to Joe Manchin's opposition. There have been hopes that it will pass either with some of those aspects removed or in a series of smaller bills, but thus far we have not seen any real movement on that plan. The second pillar of Biden's climate change policy was EPA regulation on power plants. Power plants are the second largest source of fossil fuel production in the United States, so this was going to be another big impact action. However, Republican states have sued the EPA to try to limit its power, and that case is still pending in the Supreme Court. There isn't a verdict yet, but there are expectations that the court will limit some of the powers of the EPA. So that regulation is also in a holding pattern, waiting to see what that verdict is. Okay, 2 strikes. What about his third pillar? His third pillar is regulations on the auto industry to get about 50, and to have those regulations be stringent enough that vehicle production would turn to about 50% electric vehicles sold in the US by 2030. Vehicles are the #1 source of greenhouse gas emissions in the US. This is something that the Biden administration could do, but they're finding that it is, when it comes to electoral politics, a little challenging. They're getting pushback from the auto industry and more so from union workers. And that one I had to do a double take on, but apparently it takes about 1/3 as many workers to manufacture electric vehicles as gas vehicles. So there's a worry that this could negatively impact union jobs in the auto industry. So 3 strikes so far for Biden on these. These are all things that could still be done, but thus far are all stalled. To give a little perspective about the importance of the Build Back Better plan to Biden's agenda, this graphic shows our historic emissions and projections for future emissions. You can see that dotted line with the projections show what they were before the infrastructure law. So the infrastructure law that passed gives us that orange line, our current trajectory, which is slightly better. You can see it doesn't really pay a lot of dividends until later years, but an improvement. But the green line are the projections under the Build Back Better plan. That's how Biden was going to meet his 2030 goal. And with that stalled in Congress, it really undermines the biggest part of Biden's climate agenda. So he came to office with all these ambitious plans, has got stalled in different ways. And then we had the double whammy of inflation and the Russia invasion of Ukraine, which exacerbated that inflation, particularly when it came to energy. So since the war in Ukraine, Biden has largely stopped talking about climate change. Instead, he's really been focused on trying to lower energy costs. One example is at the State of the Union address. Climate activists really thought this would be a time for Biden to frame climate change and the use of fossil fuels in the lens of the Ukrainian war and Russian energy. And to say this is it crystallizes why we shouldn't be dependent on fossil fuels. This is a call to turn to clean and renewable energy sources. But that's not really what Biden did. He did mention climate change in the sense of jobs or electric vehicles, but he was much more focused on gas and oil and how we're going to increase supply and lower prices. Since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, Biden has called for the largest ever release of oil from the strategic reserves, has started exporting US natural gas to Europe, has put pressure on US oil and gas companies to increase production, hence drilling more, has went back on that ban on drilling in federal land and has allowed some of that, and is also allowing the sale of gasoline blended with higher levels of ethanol. As you can imagine, this has not been met warmly with those who are concerned about climate change. The Interior Department under the Biden administration has tried to explain some of this. For example, saying allowing on the drilling on the federal land that they're allowing 80% less than what the corporations wanted, and they've increased the fees, the royalties on those. The corporations are complaining that the royalties are too high and the amount they're allowed to do is too low. So basically, he's got everyone mad. You can think that's a good sign of a good compromise, but also kind of ticking off people on both sides of the issue. And then when it comes to allowing the sale of gasoline blended with the higher levels of ethanol, there are concerns that burning that ethanol-rich fuel in the summertime heat could worsen smog. So overall, there is a feeling from many that when it comes to climate change, Biden overpromised and underdelivered. If there is Republican control of Congress in the midterms, then there's little hope for Biden's climate agenda to move forward. So we can look at this as one indication of Biden's ability to get his agenda through. As you're probably aware, his disapproval rates have been higher than approval rates for some time, kind of going back to that Afghanistan withdrawal. And so this is important because it is a sign of Joe Biden's political leverage to influence members like Kristen Sinema or Joe Manchin into signing on to part of Build Back Better. It also is an indicator, typically the party in office does not fare well in midterm elections. And also when you have an unpopular president, that's not going to help the Democrats in the midterm elections at all. So if Biden wants to get any action done, it's probably going to need to happen before, ideally for the Democrats, before midterm elections, so they have something to tout. To engage, the place where Biden's approval rating has fallen the most is among young people, and climate change is the issue that's particularly important to them. So that could be a motivating factor in the midterms if they could get something done. And also if they don't get something done before the midterms, it's probably not going to happen under Biden's first term. The US and major European countries were beneficiaries of the post-war system, which provided rules and institutions for states to build modern democracies and cooperative relations abroad. So in 2016, even though this kind of disintegration had been happening for a while, but in 2016, this order was shaken up as we saw, Britain vote to leave the EU, aka Brexit. The US elected Donald Trump, who had this America First isolationist agenda. Western industrial societies have seen rising economic equality, political participation, and erosion of trust in institutions. Those have played into increased nationalism, anti-immigrant sentiment, and the feeling that globalization is a threat rather than a strength. So we've certainly seen that here in the US, and we're seeing that around the world as well. Under the former administration, Trump was certainly not interested in multilateral agreements or alliances. He turned away from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the Paris Climate Agreement, and the Iran nuclear agreement. He also openly disparaged NATO and threatened to withdraw. Trump is really primarily interested in bilateral and transactional deals. Trump also largely abdicated US leadership in global alliances, and that did create opportunity for other powers like China and Russia to wield their influence. In his first year in office, Biden sought to rebuild that American leadership on the global stage. Biden sincerely believes that liberal democracies working together can solve big problems. Even though Biden views China as a rival, he's kept the Trump administration tariffs on Chinese imports, but he acknowledges that we have to cooperate with China to solve certain big issues like climate change. In a UN speech recently, President Biden mentioned allies 8 times and partners 16 times, underscoring the role he sees for global alliances and partnerships. In addition to our traditional alliances, such as NATO and the UN, the US under the Biden administration has been more engaged in the strengthening of our diplomatic and economic collaborations by working with groups like the Quad in the Indo-Pacific, as well as the recently formed security alliance between the UK, Russia, and Australia. So how does the world see this? Again, this is a global attitude survey by the Pew Research Center, and overwhelmingly, almost 90% approve of the US rejoining the World Health Organization, also rejoining the Paris Climate Agreement and hosting a summit of democratic nations. 72% globally support the US allowing more refugees. Here, this is sort of a bridge between the discussion on alliances and the discussion on the Ukraine and Russia skirmish war. And so here we see a map of NATO's expansion since 1997. So in the purple are countries that were NATO members before 1997. And then you can see all of those orange countries that joined NATO since 1997. So if you're Vladimir Putin, you're saying, and he does say, that they're putting missiles on my doorstep. Of course I'm going to react. This is not an excuse for invading a sovereign nation, but this is the landscape under which we're operating. Now we also have there was a debate as this happened in the 1990s. There was a debate among Democrats and Republicans, folks on both sides, arguing if this expansion would be provocative to Russia. But ultimately, the ratification overwhelmingly passed. And then we saw later in the 1990s, the votes became unanimous. People in the United States and in other NATO nations overwhelmingly supported this. And that is part of NATO's pledge to allow these countries in. So some argue that we would be at war with Russia right now if the Ukraine were a NATO country. But the counter argument is Russia wouldn't have invaded Ukraine at all if it were a NATO nation. Certainly, former President Trump was no fan of NATO. He often criticized what he considered underwhelming contributions of other member nations, and he threatened to withdraw from the alliance. He referred to it as a paper tiger, and still continues to negatively describe NATO. Now we have another layer with Finland and Sweden maybe becoming NATO states. I've seen reporting that next week, Finland will announce they're applying for NATO membership. And in Sweden, the parliament is conducting a security policy review. So they're looking at what are the pros and cons of joining the alliance. And they're expected to announce their decision by late May. Now, they wouldn't automatically be in NATO. Ratification can take a year. The parliaments or legislatures of all 30 NATO countries have to approve new members. But the NATO Secretary General has said the countries could join quickly and that he was sure that they could make arrangements for them in the interim period. So this will be interesting to see how Russia responds to this. Russia and Finland share a 810-mile border, and Moscow has repeatedly warned of serious consequences if Finland and Sweden join NATO. And they said that if they did, Russia in response would strengthen its land, naval, and air forces in the Baltic Sea, and they could repeatedly raise the possibility of deploying nuclear forces. When we look at global alliances and the war in Ukraine, the geopolitical landscape following the invasion of Ukraine is often discussed in the context of a new Cold War. While we might see those same sort of antagonists, this US, Russia, and increasingly China, as these major powers, the rest of the world, their roles have changed. This is less of a binary us against them like it was in the Cold War. When you have lots of governments representing about half of the people in the world are refusing to take a side. They don't want to be part of this binary. In the UN General Assembly vote to suspend Russia from the Human Rights Council, dozens of countries abstained. That includes Thailand, Brazil, Indonesia, South Africa, Mexico, and Singapore. Now, the resolution passed anyway, but these countries don't want to have to choose, are you Team USA or Team Russia? Mexico has also emphasized its neutrality, and they've rejected putting sanctions on Russia. And so this points to a confidence of smaller countries to go their own way. They want to assert that they're no longer dependent on a single ideological or economic patron in Russia or the US. So, of course, trust in the US was undermined by the American invasion of Iraq in 2003, and to some extent was what was perceived as America's absenteeism as China was working on vaccine diplomacy and other initiatives throughout the world. The US was largely seen as hoarding our supplies. Trump's actions, such as pulling out of TPP, left countries like Vietnam feeling betrayed by the US. And for Biden's part, about a third of the ambassadorships in Latin America are still unfilled. So there's lots of reasons that countries don't want to put all of their stock in the United States. Now, from Russia's side, they don't have the geopolitical clout, they don't have the money or the military strength, as we're seeing now, as the Cold War Soviet Union. So it is in some ways reminiscent of the Cold War, but in other ways very different in the global response. Another important alliance is the G20. And when in the last G20 meeting, at least a half dozen representatives from these countries walked out of the meeting when Russia started speaking. And so we're seeing not only Biden's real commitment to strengthening these alliances, but some of the major world powers in NATO and in the G20, in the United Nations, really turning their back on Russia. US President Joe Biden has said Russia should not remain a member of G20. Canada has echoed that sentiment. And there's no process for kicking out its members, but it could be possible to suspend Russia if a consensus emerged to do so. Okay, I know I'm covering a lot of topics. This is going to be the last one, and then I'm excited to have some Q&A with you. So when it comes to the Ukraine and Russia, Vladimir Putin has ratcheted up tensions with the West for years. He annexed Crimea, meddled in US elections, poisoned a spy on British soil, and those are just some of his very aggressive and criminal acts. Putin has made it clear that he views the collapse of the Soviet Union as the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the century. Those are his words. And he's vested in restoring the Soviet Union to its former glory. He views the West, particularly in recent years, as weakened, destabilized, and lacking resolve to bring any real consequences to bear on Russia for their actions. And in large part, he's been right about that. So I think, by all accounts, the resolve that we've seen emerge after the invasion of Ukraine was not what Putin or his advisors expected. And certainly Biden has taken a lead role in that coalition. Trump and Putin had a warm relationship. Trump seemed to admire Putin, as well as many other authoritarian leaders, complimenting them on their control of their countries or their intelligence. Ever since the invasion of Ukraine, Trump has bragged about how close he and Putin were. And after the Russian annexation of Crimea in 2014, Trump praised Putin and predicted the rest of Ukraine would fall fairly quickly. He said the Crimean people would rather be with Russia. And consistently, when there's disagreement under Trump's presidency between the findings of US security agencies and Putin's claims, Trump consistently sided with Putin. While he was in office, Trump propagated false claims about Ukraine. He rejected the reality that Russia engaged in election interference to benefit the Trump campaign, and instead falsely claimed that Ukraine meddled in the election in efforts to defeat Trump, despite the fact that there's no evidence to support that. These assertions were great for the Kremlin. They were being exonerated by the US president, Ukraine was being smeared, and faith in US elections was being undermined. What more could they ask for? Of course, there's also the famous phone call when it comes to Trump's interactions with Ukraine that led to his impeachment trial. On that phone call, Mr. Zelensky raised the issue of Ukraine's purchase of the Javelin anti-tank missiles, which would be a key weapon to fight Russia. And Trump's reply was, "I would like for you to do us a favor, though." And that goes back to Trump's idea of foreign relations as transactional. And so what the favor was, as you probably well know, was for Zelensky to have an investigation about the Bidens. When Trump didn't get the response he wanted, he ordered the Office of Management and Budget to withhold $391 million in military assistance. Those were funds meant to aid the Ukraine's defense against Russia. And Mr. Zelensky never got the White House visit from former President Trump that he was looking for. When Biden took office, as you can see in this photo, he did have Zelensky to the White House. At the time of the phone call, Zelensky desperately needed lethal aid, and he wanted to show a united front that the Ukraine was backed by the US, and he didn't get that. But what he did get was, while he was in office, Trump did send lethal aid to Ukraine. So he withheld the aid, but did eventually send it. Federal watchdog later determined the withholding of the aid was illegal, but he did eventually send it. And Trump sent lethal aid that was a reversal of what the Obama administration had done. The Obama administration refused to send offensive weapons to Ukraine. And so this is something that Trump has touted and was part of his defense against the impeachment claims, that I did more for Ukraine than the Obama administration did. Now, when discussing Russia's efforts to invade Ukraine, Early on, Trump referred to Putin's strategy as genius. In subsequent interviews, refused to identify Putin's actions as evil. So in recent days, he has come out with some statements against Russia, but it's been a long time coming and maybe a bit disingenuous. Biden sees this as a time for the US to rise to the challenge to make the world safe for democracy. He's dramatically increased the flow of arms to Ukraine, including anti-tank missiles, anti-aircraft systems, and other weapons. He's led the global coalition for this, has put pressure on other leaders in Europe to increase their sanctions on Russia. And leading up to the invasion of Ukraine, Biden declassified and broadcast intelligence about Russia's plans. He also worked with diplomatic channels to try to come to a peaceful resolution and work with allies to prepare a sanctions package in advance of the invasion. Now, one of the interesting developments that's happened recently with this is, so at the beginning of the Ukrainian invasion, the US, the Biden administration, was really focused on Ukraine. So how can we get a peaceful resolution? How can we negotiate that? How can we get Russia to pull back from Ukrainian borders? And it was really our focus after the invasion escalated was about Ukrainian sovereignty and violations of international law. As things got worse, the rhetoric from the Biden administration became more about war crimes and other human rights violations. We started announcing larger aid, more weapons, more sanctions. And it was sort of reminiscent of what Roosevelt did before we entered World War II with trying to send supplies to the Allies and use some language to help them. In some ways, it was bigger and faster even, and more assertive of taking the side of Ukraine. But recently, Secretary of State Austin, so the Secretary of State Austin and Anthony Blinken went to Ukraine to visit. And in a discussion afterwards, Secretary of State Austin said, we want to see Russia weakened to the point it cannot do the types of things it's done to Ukraine. Previously, the administration's line, as I said, had been focused on Ukraine. Biden has been explicit about not wanting this to be a Russia versus US situation, not wanting it to be World War III. So this was a real change of tone. The administration said they wanted Russia to emerge as a weakened state, but that could have meant reputationally, economically, militarily. But this was a very explicit kind of pitting of the US against Russia. So with this statement, Austin seemed to suggest the real role of the United States is to degrade Russian military power. And so that is certainly a shift in tone and can make this seem more like a proxy war. That could be problematic because if Putin views this as a proxy war against the US, he will go all in. So that's another layer that we're experiencing now. Biden delivered an impassioned plea to Congress asking for additional $33 billion of support for Ukraine. And I think he'll get it. It's just a matter of what are they going to package it with? Are they going to do it alone, put COVID funding or other issues with that? Biden definitely sees this as a time for the US to rise to the challenge and make the world safe for democracy. And this isn't just about the Ukraine and Russia and the United States and our allies. China is watching this closely as they gauge what actions they could take with Taiwan. So what will they learn from this? Hopefully their lesson is that these kind of aggressive actions will trigger a global backlash, but that remains to be seen. So this shows a bit about where we're at. I think this was as of a couple of days ago. What's the date on there? Yes, May 3rd. The pink areas are under Russian military control. The lines are Russian advances. And so we can see sort of the situation in Ukraine right now. There's no doubt the Ukrainian people and Vladimir Zelensky are exceeding all expectations in thwarting Russia's advances. And the international community continues to increase our commitment to supporting them, whether it is, training people on weapons outside of Ukraine and sending them back into Ukraine, trying to have increased sanctions. So the EU just announced that they're looking at a proposal to ban Russian oil, which will take a real toll on them. You have to look at the toll this is taking on domestic policy and what that support is as well. And so here are some polls. Most Americans say the US is providing too little or the right amount support to Ukraine. So only 14% of people say we're providing too much support here in the US. So that says that maybe Biden's on the right track there. Over a third saying we need to do more, which we're trying to get passed in Congress. Most Americans support increasing humanitarian and military aid along with sanctions. So when you look here, 76% of Americans, can we get 76% of Americans to agree on anything? Apparently this, provide more humanitarian support to Ukraine. Increased economic sanctions, 67%, provide more military support, 55%. And where Americans really are drawing the line though, and where Joe Biden has drawn the line, is taking direct military action against Russia. Again, how concerned are you about this? So the war in Ukraine expanding into other European countries. That's something Americans are very concerned about. US forces getting involved in the fighting. That's something Americans do not want. And particularly with some of the rhetoric that Putin has used recently, concerned about the use of Russian nuclear weapons, which is a very realistic concern. And about 2/3 of Americans are concerned that these sanctions are contributing to higher food and energy prices, which they certainly are. And so, Americans say we should do more, we should send more money, but when it hits them, either, at the gas station or the grocery store, then we tend to be a little more concerned about that. So in conclusion, if we look at how are we perceived around the world in sort of contrasting the Biden global agenda and the Trump global agenda, you can see here at the end of the Trump presidency, 83% of those surveyed in 12 countries said they had no confidence in the US president to do the right thing regarding world affairs. Now, at the beginning of the Biden presidency, we saw 75% say they have confidence in the US president to do the right thing. On the right side, at the end of the Trump presidency, 63% globally had a negative view of the US, and now 62% at the beginning of the Biden presidency have a positive view of the US. So I think it's fair to say that on the global stage, and particularly among Western allies, that the Biden agenda and approach to foreign policy is trusted much more and is seen as a much more reliable ally. There are concerns, how long will the Biden presidency last? And will Trump be president again in 2024? So how much can we really trust and put our faith in the United States? And that's a narrative that our rivals in Russia and China are going to forward as well. So I will stop here and I will say that, again, I know there's so much to cover just on those foreign policy topics, lots of other topics, and domestic agenda. So I will do my best to field whatever questions you have.
Thank you for that presentation, Dr. Mannion. I am going to abuse my power as moderator and ask the first question before I turn it over to everybody else for Q&A. Again, as you are coming up with your questions, please use the Q&A function, not the chat box, so that it's easier for me to keep up with who is asking what. The question that I have for you that we'll open up with, you touched on Biden's aid to Ukraine being tied to human rights abuses, and as sort of the situation became more horrific, he seemed to be more willing to commit more aid. He has called what Russia has done a genocide. That is not a word that is used in international relations very lightly. In fact, Trump certainly didn't use it, and Obama also did not use it when talking about China or Myanmar or a number of other, or even historical genocides like the Armenian genocide. Biden and his administration, Secretary Blinken, have labeled several ongoing genocides around the world, acknowledged the Armenian genocide. Do you think this speaks to more sort of clarity over what a genocide is? Is this reflective of a foreign policy that cares about crimes against humanity more so than previous administrations, or what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a good question. I do think that Biden really does see America's role in leading on human rights issues globally. He takes that very seriously. So I do think it is a shift, and it's indicative of the president himself's vision and views. President Biden is also known for speaking off the cuff quite a bit. And so when he called Putin's acts genocide in Ukraine, he was asked later, what made him use the word genocide, or if he wanted to clarify that. But he stood by those remarks and said it's become clearer and clearer that Putin is trying to wipe out the idea of even being able to be Ukrainian. So he also acknowledged that, he's not the attorney, he's not the UN, and so he can't give that official definition. But from his perspective, there is plenty of evidence to show that this is an act of genocide. The UN defines genocide as acts committed with the intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnic, or racial or religious group. And so, Biden's assertion is that Putin's actions are an attempt to destroy this whole national group, and thus they are genocide.
Thank you. We have one question right now in the chat. Please feel free to use that, audience. It's from Rachel
I should
Carpenter.
also, Stephen, note that I think it was just like this week that Trump used the word genocide to refer to this as well. It was in the context of criticizing Biden and saying, this wouldn't have happened if Trump was president, but he said, this genocide is happening. So now Trump has used that word as well.
Interesting. I had missed that. Okay, I will turn it over now for a question from Rachel Carpenter. One of the most prevalent criticisms I hear regarding Biden's strategy to return to the norms of the politics of past decades is that without equivalency from his detractors, that philosophy essentially amounts to concession. Many of his supporters, especially within the context of recent events and the failure of progress in this term, are frustrated that this seems to be the case. I've seen speculation that there is a timing component at play here. That is that Biden will take a stronger stance, abandoning the consensus building strategy in a strategic manner that's timed with the midterm elections. This seems like a heavy deviation from his general habits, but he seems to be running out of options as compromise seems to result less in everyone is a little bit unhappy and more everyone is very unhappy. So what are your thoughts on Biden's willingness to adjust his efforts in this manner? I think she was speaking more domestic policy, but that could also very easily apply to foreign policy. So feel free to be wide-ranging in your thoughts there.
Well, I think to me, the first clear example that comes to mind that does affirm this is Biden's stance on climate change. So you come in with these big, bold ideas, and even if they get thwarted by, in some ways, forces outside your control, Joe Manchin or the Supreme Court, in other ways, capitulating maybe to the automakers and the unions, and worrying about gas prices and how that will affect domestic electoral policy and the Democrats' prospects in the midterm elections. Obama did a similar thing in 2012. He had this big, domestic policy, gas or climate change policy. Gas prices went up, and his advisors were like, "You can't do that right now before the midterm elections." So, as I said at the opening, I think pragmatically, but also philosophically, that Biden sees domestic policy as part of foreign policy, and that if we have, fair and free elections, if we have a thriving economy, if our technology and infrastructure are world class, then that puts us as the shining light on the hill for other countries and is a good contrast to authoritarian regimes.
Great. Next, we have a question from Dr. Ruth Yob. Thank you for the wonderful presentation. In what ways do you think the war in Ukraine will impact upcoming midterm elections and also the presidential election? Can the United States claim to be a guardian of human rights when its own domestic constituency disagrees on the country's vexed relations with the ICC and the ICJ?
Okay, good questions, Dr. Yob. So, well, there's a couple issues here. So the first one is when it comes to the domestic elections, I would say that this definitely is an issue. On one hand, it could be a benefit to Biden. He's seen as being a steady leader. Americans overwhelmingly support America's support of Ukraine. And I think that, this does give him a chance to showcase his ability to collaborate on a global stage, to sort of coalesce our allies and to make a real impact and stand up to Russia. So I think in those ways, it's a positive. It's an area where Biden's getting pretty good approval in a time where he's not getting much good approval. Now, to counter that, there is a narrative, and public opinion polling seems to say that a lot of Americans believe this about this wouldn't have happened under Trump's watch. And so I think that's a counter narrative that a lot of folks, particularly on the right, are using that can actually frame this as a negative for Biden, that because he's weak and maybe in some of the ways that Rachel talked about with compromise and other things, that these domestic incursions happen. It wouldn't happen under a strong president like Trump. So that could be a negative side. Although a lot of, I think about 80% of Republicans share that view, but in recent polling, a majority of independents share that view as well. So that could be problematic. Another way that's very apparent that this can affect the midterm elections is inflation and gas and food prices in particular. So I think that in those ways, this war can affect the midterm election. We have a lot of time between now and the midterm elections. Typically, foreign policy is not very front of mind for American voters, but this is an exception. So I think we'll have to see what is happening with this war in the next several months. When we look at the International Court of Justice and the ICC, I think, America has, said that certain organizations do not hold sway over our actions and we cannot be held to account by them. And so now we are, sort of pointing fingers at Russia for doing this. And Putin has used the same language too, right? Saying the US has had these invasions and who are we to criticize them for what they're doing. So I do think some of our history and background does undermine our credibility sometimes on these issues. I think, Biden is doing his best to try to resurrect our image on the global stage, but that's not an easy process. And certainly we have a history that can be called to account.
Great, thank you. Feel free to continue to put questions in the Q&A. I'll leave that open for a few more minutes. I will continue to abuse my power as moderator and ask another question.
Absolutely.
In the meantime, I have been thinking about this quite a bit. You mentioned the previous administration's withdrawal from the Trans-Pacific Partnership negotiations. And we recently saw the Biden administration strike a deal with several Pacific countries for securities and or for securities things, submarines, things like that, that also kind of undercut some of our European allies. So I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit more about how Biden views maintaining strong relations, economic relations outside the US while continuing to build infrastructure and increase domestic production and things like that.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. So I think that, Biden is certainly a multilateralist and he believes in these coalitions and cooperation. He once renewed US engagement with international organizations, including the World Trade Organization. I do think that Biden both sees and prioritizes investments in US infrastructure and innovation as domestic policy and foreign policy, sort of like I alluded to. I don't think he's going to be engaging in, those bilateral trade agreements necessarily, but I think, like you mentioned, some of those regional coalitions and agreements, he's interested in those and has thought those out, part in an effort, again, to thwart China, but also to increase both our infrastructure and innovation and our manufacturing in the United States. I think that, having strong jobs, this is something no matter what Biden's talking about, if it's climate change, if it's US foreign policy, it's always does come back to like strong American jobs and building that infrastructure at home. So I think that's part of his approach in all of those steps. And I think that, part of the knock on Biden too, though, is that infrastructure bill. I just heard recently someone saying like, there's bipartisan agreement on infrastructure. Why can't we get anything done? And it's like, oh, we did do that. So part of it is it happened during a pandemic. It was hard to sort of go on the road and tout those achievements. But, this was a knock on Obama. And it's something that Trump actually did really well, touting all of his achievements. And so I think that it's important to talk about those investments on the domestic stage and the global stage.
Thank you for that very thoughtful answer. There are a few more questions that have popped up in the Q&A. Another one from Rachel. Given an impending global food crisis, ongoing famine in African states, Ukraine, India, potential cross-slop due to heat, various supply chain input issues, it seems like food aid is likely to be an increasingly important part of Biden's soft diplomacy strategy. But at the same time, there are unequal climate effects on U.S. agriculture productive capacity, such as the ongoing drought in California and the rest of the West. You mentioned the wildfires. And these are moving to the forefront of U.S. politics. How do you think Biden is going to balance those sort of competing demands?
A really good question, as always, from Rachel. Yeah, I think this is something that the global community is trying to get their heads around right now. So I think the immediate issue there that we've been responding to are fossil fuel energy issues, trying to lessen those. But I think the longer term and perhaps more important issue is going to be the impact on food supply. And so I haven't seen a lot being put out yet on what the strategies for that are. But it's certainly going to be something that we're going to see a ripple effect, and that's going to be a lasting effect. And then when it comes to climate change, for India, for example, had been hoping to really ramp up their production of wheat and other products to help fill that void. But now they've had record high heat this year, and it's destroying their crops. So instead of a country like India being able to fill the gap when this war is happening in our breadbasket, climate change has actually destroyed their crops. So we're going to be behind on that aspect as well. So Rachel, this is something that I'm really concerned about, and I think a lot of people are, but I haven't really heard a definitive discussion on the global stage or from the Biden administration on how this is going to be addressed.
Thank you. Turning to now a question from Patrick Kelleher now. I realize we're running short on time, but would Professor Mannion speak to the extent to which Biden and his administration are viewing American foreign policy through the lens of the global war on terror, and perhaps how the administration is trying to avoid a second Cold War? Is the administration going to be able to break away from these paradigms and operate under a new set of assumptions and threats, et cetera?
Well, first of all, I apologize that my talk went longer than I meant it to. This is such a broad subject, and I deleted all my slides on immigration too. So yeah. When it comes to Patrick's question, so I think that he was asking about Biden, how he sees this through the lens of the Cold War and the war on terror. Biden, some might think that he's hawkish because he has been engaged in U.S. foreign policy for so long. But in a lot of ways, he's argued against additional deployments in the Obama administration. He was very set on the withdrawal from Afghanistan, as botched as that may have been. And I think he does see the global war on terror has, in a lot of ways, fails, but also as not a strategic use of our resources. And so I think rather than those sort of like preemptive strikes and not acting in coalitions and not gathering our friends together, as we did in the war on terror, I think Biden is very focused on having those conversations. So for example, with the Ukrainian invasion, well before the actual invasion happened, he was putting out intelligence. He was working with Ukraine, but also with our allies to figure out like what are our next steps going to be? How can we act in concert on this and present a united front? So I think that's different than how we acted on the war on terror, which it was like, we do what we want, come along or don't. And if you don't, you're either with us or against us. I don't think that Biden has that philosophy or tactic currently. When it comes to the Cold War, I do think that he sees, Russia and China as an adversary. I think Biden, less than just identifying a country, although China has been on most people's radar, and he sees it as like democracies versus authoritarian regimes. And I think that that's largely how he views the world order, and that he really, less than attacking authoritarian regimes, He wants to marshal democracies to work together, to show they can solve big problems, to show that they're thriving, and to use that as our biggest foreign policy tool, that we can collaborate to work together to solve climate change. We can come together to defend the people of Ukraine and stand for sovereign nations. We can strengthen NATO. So I think that those are more Biden's approaches from that aspect. I don't know if I hit all the points of that question, but
I think so. So there are a few questions. Some are domestic policy, some are still focused very much on foreign policy. I'm going to sort of adapt one of the ones on domestic policy, asking if Roe versus Wade were to be struck down, is there anything that can be done to maintain women's reproductive rights? And I'm going to throw in a mention to the Helms Amendment and whether Biden has followed the Helms Amendment for foreign aid or whether he has looked to move around that. The Helms Amendment prevents U.S. aid from being used to fund abortion care overseas. So if you'd like to speak to sort of his commitment to women's rights domestically and globally, this is a good opportunity to do so.
Yes. Okay. So let's see if I can hit this. So first of all, I mean, I think this has been the big conversation topic of the week was the situation with the leak of the Supreme Court's draft decision. If Roe versus Wade is overturned, then these decisions would go back to the states. It is, oops, I'm sorry. It could be very troubling for a lot of people and very bolstering for a lot of people. But I think in one sense, this erosion has been happening since the Casey decision, where it really allowed states to put restrictions. So even though Roe versus Wade is still the law of the land, in practice in Missouri, there are very few abortions being performed in the state because the regulations that have been imposed since the Casey decision did things like putting ultrasound, 72-hour waiting periods, restrictions that, clinics have hospital grade facilities, which closed many clinics in Missouri. So in practice, even though Roe versus Wade is the law of the land, women in Missouri have a right to abortion. There's one clinic. And for example, if you live in Springfield, Missouri, and you have to drive 5 hours to St. Louis for that, then you have to wait 72 hours after you're seen to go back and have your procedure. So you're talking about a several day costly endeavor. So in practice, in many states like Missouri, abortion access has been minimal at best. So what has happened is Missourians go across the border to Illinois, where you can get your full treatment in one day, have your procedure done, just like other medical procedures. And so I say that not to be cavalier, but maybe to give folks who are nervous like a little glimmer of the landscape might not actually change that much in Missouri in practice, even though having that constitutional protection is certainly key. The other thing that I would say, maybe to give folks a glimmer of hope who are worried about this, is that about, I think it's over half of the abortions that were performed medically through the pill. And so that's something that could still potentially be accessed by Missourians. What can be done? We've heard a lot of talk about codifying Roe versus Wade in Congress. In reality, that can't happen right now. The House already passed legislation earlier this year that went to the Senate and got, I can't remember, 46 votes, I believe. Joe Manchin is pro-life and is not going to vote for that. He's also not going to vote to remove the filibuster. And so when it comes to any vote in the Senate, you would need 60 votes. Those aren't there. And just to get the 51 votes to remove the filibuster, those aren't there. And so even when they wanted to remove the filibuster for a narrow issue, like restrict it to just voting rights, the Democrats didn't have the votes. So if this is something people are worried about, I don't want to discourage you, but I don't see how this is going to get codified in Congress under the current Congress. The best thing you can do at this point, if this is something you're concerned about, if you're happy about it, be happy about it. But if you're concerned about it, I would say what has been the most important measure for the last 2 decades is vote for your state legislators, contact them and tell them where you stand on these issues. So if and when the trigger law goes into place in Missouri, what that is, back in 2019, Missouri passed a law saying if Roe v. Wade is overturned, then abortions in Missouri will be outlawed. We're one of many states that put this kind of trigger law into effect. Our Attorney General is chomping at the bit to make that declaration. And so that will happen basically immediately if and when Roe v. Wade is overturned. Missouri's law does not provide any exceptions for rape or incest, only for a medical emergency. Now, in a sense, those who don't feel good about this change, this could backfire. If you look at polling, even I saw some recent polling that just focused on Missouri, there's not majority support for a complete ban on abortion, a complete overturn of Roe v. Wade, particularly when you don't have exceptions for rape and incest. And I think one piece of evidence I would use to support that is if you listen to the talking points of Missouri politicians or national conservative politicians, they are not hitting the airwaves and saying, this is great, there's no more Roe v. Wade, abortions are going to be over. They're saying, let's talk about this leak. That's the real problem, right? And so that tells me that they might not feel like a total ban on abortions is a winning issue. Okay, I went down a long step with that. So when you talk about the Helms Amendment, there's been a lot of criticism of Biden on this, that this amendment prohibits the use of foreign assistance to pay for abortion. And I don't see any movement on that. Now it could, the Biden administration is saying they're looking into possible anything they could do through the executive branch to work on issues of abortion. So maybe they act on this as a symbolic gesture, if nothing else, to show that they're in support of reproductive rights. So this could be a trigger for them to do that. We'll have to wait and see.
Okay, thank you. We will turn to one maybe final question that's got a couple parts. It seems that Russia has benefited from the Trump administration withdrawal from the international stage. China has stepped into that vacuum with an economic goal in mind, and Russia with military power in mind. How can the United States reclaim the global position of leadership that we had? Could this be considered a proxy war between the main powers such as the EU and America and the US, since we're not in direct war with Russia? And with inflation and now the Russia war, why isn't there a greater push for Biden's plan to wean everybody off of oil and natural gas?
Yeah, so I think that you're right about the benefits to Russia and China from our withdrawal from the world stage. That gives them credence, it gives them power, and it lets them say to other countries, you can't rely on the US. Why are you putting all your eggs in that US basket? They failed you before, they're unpredictable, and you can't rely on them. And those are fair arguments. So I think that you're right about that. How can the US reclaim their position? I think that is a real, and Biden said this on the campaign trail, I think that's a real priority for him, is to reestablish our presence on the world stage, our credibility. I think some of the surveys that I showed would indicate maybe he's being successful at that. I think that, the way that our global partners are stepping up in our support for Ukraine and our attempts to support Russia is also a good indicator of that. I think though, there's still this uncertainty. Sure, they might trust the Biden administration, what they're doing, but what's going to happen in 2 years from now when we have that 2024 election? And so I think that there's still that level of uncertainty and maybe hesitation to put all your stock in America. Could this be considered a proxy war? I think that some of the recent language that has come out would frame this more as a proxy war. I don't think that's ultimately what Biden wants. I think it could lead to escalation, because if Putin sees this as Russia versus US, there's no negotiation, there's winning and losing. And so I think that is a dangerous kind of slope for us to get on. So I hope we can keep framing this as standing up for a sovereign nation that has been illegally invaded. I think that's the better path forward. And I think also if it turns into a US proxy war with Russia, then what does that do to our partners? Where's their stake in that? And do they want to be involved in a proxy war between US and Russia? Again, like revisiting the Cold War. I don't think that's a good selling point for us in our international coalitions either. With inflation now, Russian war, is there a greater push? Yeah, so I think your question about, why didn't we use this opportunity? Why didn't Biden use this opportunity to really emphasize how we need to get away from fossil fuels and change our whole energy structure? I think that's what so many people were hoping for. But I also believe that they do not see that as a winning policy of the ballot box in November. What people care about is how much is my gas costs, how much my food costs, what is the president doing about this, the stickers that are on the gas pumps, with Biden's face on them. This is what people care about the ballot box. And even though electric vehicles and renewable energy are the bigger solution, that's a several step process for voters to make. It's something that's not going to happen by November. And so I think electorally, the Biden administration has backed off those initiatives.
Okay, I said one last question before that question, but there is one last question to get through. One of the 4 main points Biden said he would address are racial issues in the US. Has there been any progress or plans made in that regard?
Yeah, Biden has signed some executive actions around this. He's supported and went on the road trying to also garner support for the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, which would go through Congress. And the issue there is looking at issues of voter disenfranchisement and fairness on elections throughout the country. So I think he also views that as an issue of racial equity, particularly when we look at how different policies disenfranchise certain groups of people in elections and voting. But another way that he's tried to do that is by appointing the most racially diverse cabinet in US history. And having, he's directed every agency to, as they enact policy, that they're supposed to consider whether it will advance racial equity and how there have been impacts of systemic racism in their previous policies and how will their policies moving forward support underserved communities. So I think that he's tried to do what he can in that sense from symbolic and administrative perspectives. Also in the American Rescue Act, there were additional funding for investment in Black-owned businesses. And I think he also sees initiatives that he tried to continue, such as the child tax credit, as being historic in lifting children out of poverty. And a lot of that had to do with children of color and families of color. So I think there's a lot of these sort of smaller initiatives. Certainly also the Biden administration has changed its perspective from the Department of Justice on consent decrees and how they're overseeing policing, where the Trump administration really stepped back from that. I think that the Biden administration, Department of Justice, is taking a much more forward-facing and active role in overseeing discrimination in policing as well.
Great. Well, thank you so much for your thoughtful presentation and your incredibly thorough and thoughtful responses to the questions that we've had today. I've really enjoyed this conversation. I will go ahead and close us out. If you have do you have any final remarks, Dr. Mannion, or?
No, thanks for sticking with me on a unwieldy topic and unending topic. And I saw Monica's comment in the chat. I'm very happy to share the slides. Monica, you can just email me, she's in my class. But if anyone else wants the slides, you're welcome to reach out and I'm happy to share those. Thank you, Stephen, and thanks to our hosts as well.
Great. Want to thank again the Global Affairs Council of St. Louis, UMSL Global, and the Foreign Policy Association for sponsoring this event. The next event will be focused on industrial policy with Professor John Horn on May 5th from 12 p.m. to 1:30 p.m. May 5th seems not right, but that's the date I have. Check the World Affairs Council of St. Louis website for more information on that. These quality programs can only happen because of the support of our membership. So please become a member of the World Affairs Council of St. Louis today. Thank you all.